When the prison gate slammed shut behind me after 3 long years, I thought the worst was over. Then I walked onto my father's porch, and my stepmother looked me dead in the eye and said, "Your father died a year ago, now get off my property." But she didn't know about the key in my pocket. The air outside the facility felt too thin, almost sharp. For 1,095 days, all I breathed was heavy, recycled air mixed with damp concrete and sweat. I had a single duffel bag slung over my shoulder, containing everything I owned: 2 pairs of faded jeans, 3 t-shirts, a cheap digital watch, and a discharge slip that proved I was no longer an inmate. I didn't call a ride. I wanted to walk. I needed to feel the pavement beneath my old sneakers, to see the way the afternoon sun hit the asphalt in Ohio without looking through chain link fencing. My destination was 40 minutes away, the house I grew up in, the house my father built with his own 2 hands. As I turned the corner onto Elm Street, my heart started hammering against my ribs. Something felt wrong before I even reached the driveway. The house looked different. The front door, which had been a familiar, welcoming navy blue for 20 years, was now painted a cold, modern slate gray. A pristine, expensive-looking mat sat at the threshold, reading "Home Sweet Home" in elegant cursive. The flower beds my mother had tended until her passing were gone, replaced by sharp, white landscaping rocks and dramatic landscape lighting. I climbed the porch steps, my lungs burning from the sudden rush of anxiety. I knocked. I didn't ring the bell. I knocked hard, with the authority of someone who still believed, deep down, that he belonged there. The door swung open. Linda stood there, my stepmother. Her platinum blonde hair was perfectly styled, not a single strand out of place. She wore a silk cream-colored blouse that practically screamed money, paired with heavy gold jewelry that clinked softly as she moved. She didn't gasp. She didn't smile. She just stood there, holding a half-empty glass of white wine, looking at me like I was a piece of junk mail delivered to the wrong address. "You're out," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of any warmth. "Where's Dad, Linda?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. I tried to look past her shoulder into the hallway, but she shifted her weight, deliberately blocking my view. "His truck isn't in the driveway. I tried calling his cell from the halfway house yesterday, but it said the number was disconnected." Linda's mouth tightened into a hard, thin line. "Your father was buried a year ago, Eli." The words hung in the muggy afternoon air like shattered glass. For a second, my brain refused to process them. Buried? A year ago? What? I stepped forward, but she didn't flinch. "What do you mean, buried? Why didn't anyone tell me?" I was allowed phone calls. I was allowed letters. A cruel, faint curl appeared at the corner of her lips. It wasn't a smile. It was pure, unadulterated satisfaction. "You were in prison, Eli, for grand larceny. You embarrassed this family. What were we supposed to do? Send you a nice little sympathy card in the cell block?" Thomas had a stroke. It was quick. By the time the estate was settled, this house became mine. And frankly, we've moved on. Before I could ask another question, she stepped back and pulled the door shut. Not with a dramatic slam, but slowly, deliberately. The heavy deadbolt clicked into place. The sound echoed on the quiet suburban street. I stood on that porch for what felt like hours, staring at the dark gray wood. My father was gone. The man who had held my hand when my mother died, the man who swore he would find a way to prove my innocence, had passed away while I was locked in a cage, and my stepmother hadn't even given him a proper goodbye from his only son. I had nowhere else to go. My money was nearly non-existent, saved only from the meager cents per hour prison jobs. I walked to a local diner, sat in the back booth with a cup of black coffee, and tried to keep my hands from shaking. That was when I remembered Harold. Harold was the old groundskeeper at the cemetery outside of town, a man who had been friends with my father since high school. If my father was buried anywhere, Harold would know. An hour later, I was walking through the iron gates of Oak Ridge Cemetery. The smell of fresh-cut grass and damp earth was overwhelming. I found Harold near the maintenance shed, resting his hands on a rusty rake. He wore his trademark faded canvas jacket, his face weathered by decades of Ohio winters. He looked up as my shadow fell over him. His eyes widened slightly beneath his bushy gray eyebrows. "Eli? Good Lord, boy. They let you out." "Today," I said, dropping my duffel bag on the gravel path. "Linda told me he's gone." "Harold? Where is he?" Harold looked around the quiet cemetery, his expression shifting from surprise to something heavy, almost conspiratorial. He didn't answer my question immediately. Instead, he dropped the rake against the shed and walked over to me, leaning in close. "Don't go looking for a stone, Eli," Harold muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's not here." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean he's not here?" Linda said. "Linda lies," Harold interrupted fiercely. "Your daddy didn't have a stroke, Eli. He was sick, yes, but he knew what was coming. And he knew what she and that pathetic son of hers, Trevor, did to you." "Trevor?" 3 years ago, I was working as the junior accountant for my father's logistics company. When nearly $200,000 went missing from the primary corporate accounts, all fingers pointed to me. The digital signatures were mine. The wire transfers originated from my apartment's IP address. I had maintained my innocence until I was blue in the face, but the evidence was overwhelming, perfectly orchestrated. I was sentenced to 4 years. "Your dad figured it out right after they locked you up," Harold said, reaching into the deep inner pocket of his canvas jacket. He pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila envelope. It was battered, the corners bent, but my name was written across the front in my father's heavy, blocky handwriting. "Thomas came to see me about 4 months before he passed. He was weak, using an oxygen tank, but his mind was sharp as a razor. He told me, 'Harold, if Linda finds out what I'm doing, she'll destroy it. When Eli walks out of that place, you give him this. Nobody else.'" My hands went completely numb as I took the envelope. It felt incredibly heavy. "Go somewhere safe, Eli," Harold said, patting my shoulder with his gloved hand, "and get back what's yours." I took the envelope to a cheap $20 a night motel on the edge of the county line. The room smelled of old cigarettes and industrial cleaner, but it had a lock on the door and a small desk. I sat on the edge of the creaking mattress and tore the envelope open. Inside, wrapped in a piece of loose leaf paper, was a silver flash drive and a small brass key with a plastic tag attached. Written on the tag in my father's hand were the words, "Unit 108, Westridge Storage." I plugged the flash drive into a cheap prepaid smartphone I had purchased at a convenience store earlier. A single video file popped up. I clicked play. The screen filled with my father's face. He looked devastatingly thin, his cheeks sunken and his skin pale, but his gray eyes were steady, burning with a fierce intensity one recognized instantly. He was sitting in his old workshop in the basement, the background dark. Eli. His voice came through the small phone speaker, raspy but clear. If you're watching this, it means Harold did his job. You're a free man, and I'm no longer here to stand beside you. I am so sorry, son. I am so sorry I let them take those years from you. I swallowed hard, a lump rising in my throat as I stared at the screen. The night you were arrested, my father continued, leaning closer to the camera. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, but as the months went on, I started digging into the company records myself. I became a spy in my own home, Eli. I watched Linda, and I watched her son, Trevor, and I found what they did. My father paused, coughing heavily into a handkerchief before regaining his composure. Trevor had a massive gambling debt with some very bad people in Cleveland. Linda knew. To save her son, she helped him access our corporate servers. She was the one who copied your digital certificates from the home computer. She gave Trevor your passwords. They planted the routing evidence on your personal laptop while you were out celebrating my birthday. A cold rage, hotter than anything I had felt during my entire 3 years in maximum security, began to bloom in my chest. I couldn't just go to the police, my father explained, his expression darkening. Linda had already structured the business assets so that if I tried to divorce her or accuse her without ironclad proof, she would automatically gain control of the company through a clause we signed years ago. She was poisoning my medication, Eli. Nothing lethal enough to show up on a standard panel, but enough to keep me weak, confused, and out of the office. I had to play dumb. I had to let them think they won, while I gathered the real evidence. He held up a key matching the one in my hand. Everything is at Westridge Storage, Unit 108. The altered bank logs, the original unedited server forensics, and most importantly, a recorded confession from Trevor that I obtained after letting him believe I was altering my will to leave him everything. Watch yourself, Eli. Linda is desperate. If you go after her without the law completely on your side, she won't just try to put you back in prison. She might take your life. Use the lawyers I retained. Their names are in the box. I love you, son. Fix this. The video cut to black. The next morning, the sun hadn't even cleared the horizon when I arrived at Westridge Storage. The facility was a sprawling complex of corrugated steel buildings surrounded by barbed wire. I found Unit 108 near the back. My hand shook as I inserted the brass key into the padlock. The lock snapped open with a loud metallic echo. I pulled the rolling door up. Inside were 6 heavy plastic storage crates stacked neatly against the wall. Each one was meticulously labeled with black marker. Forensics, corporate tax 2023, bank records, Trevor/Linda. I opened the first crate. On top was a folder labeled confession. Inside was a second flash drive and a signed, notarized statement from a private investigator my father had hired secretly. I played the audio file on the drive. It was Trevor's voice, arrogant and slightly slurred, bragging about how easy it had been to frame the golden boy and how his mother had handled the digital footprints. There were hundreds of pages of bank records showing massive cash withdrawals from the corporate accounts matching the exact dates of Trevor's trips to casinos in Atlantic City and Cleveland. There were also medical reports from a private toxicology clinic my father had visited under an assumed name, proving his blood contained elevated levels of prescription sedatives he had never been prescribed. They hadn't just stolen my freedom. They had systematically murdered my father to keep their secret safe. I didn't go back to the house. I walked straight into the downtown offices of Grant & Associates, the legal firm my father had mentioned at the end of the video file. Within 10 minutes, I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room with Marisol Grant, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney who had known my father for a decade. She spent 3 hours going through the documents, her face growing grimmer with every page she turned. When she finally finished reading Trevor's signed investigator report, she pushed her glasses up her nose and looked at me. Eli, this isn't just an embezzlement case anymore, she said quietly. This is a criminal conspiracy, falsifying evidence, and potentially corporate homicide. Your father didn't just collect papers, he built a cage for them. How long will it take? I asked, my knuckles white against the table. We aren't going to the local police, Marisol said, picking up her desk phone. Your stepmother has connections in the county sheriff's department. We're going straight to the state prosecutor and the FBI's financial crimes division. By tomorrow morning, their world is going to end. 2 days later, I was sitting in a rented car across the street from my childhood home. The afternoon was quiet, the sky a dull, flat gray. At exactly 2 p.m., 3 black SUVs pulled into the driveway, blocking Linda's pristine, late-model Mercedes. 6 federal agents in windbreakers stepped out, accompanied by 2 state troopers. They walked up the porch steps, the same steps I had been ordered to leave just 48 hours prior. When Linda opened the door, she wasn't wearing her elegant cream blouse. She was in a bathrobe, her hair unwashed. I watched from across the street as an agent handed her a document, a federal search warrant, and an asset seizure notice. Within minutes, Trevor arrived in his sports car, only to be immediately intercepted by 2 agents in the driveway. He tried to argue, shouting and gesturing wildly, but an officer grabbed his arms, spinning him around and slapping heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. Linda was led out next, her face pale, her hands bound in front of her. She looked frantic, her eyes scanning the street until they locked onto my rented sedan. I rolled the window down slowly. I didn't yell. I didn't wave. I just sat there, letting her see my face, letting her see the silver key to Unit 108 dangling from my fingers in the sunlight. The realization hit her visible across the distance. Her mouth opened in a silent scream of rage as the troopers guided her into the back of the transport vehicle. It took another 14 months of legal battles, depositions, and grand jury testimony to fully dismantle the mess they had made. Trevor took a plea deal, sentencing him to 12 years for corporate fraud and conspiracy. Linda went to trial, desperate to save herself, but my father's medical records and the toxicological evidence were insurmountable. She was convicted of reckless endangerment, insurance fraud, and grand theft, receiving an 18-year sentence without the possibility of early parole. The company was liquidated to pay off the debts and legal fees, but the house on Elm Street was returned to me by court order. Yesterday, I walked up those porch steps again. The slate gray paint on the front door was gone. I had spent the previous weekend scraping it away, restoring the deep, familiar navy navy blue my mother had chosen. I walked inside the quiet house, carrying a small cardboard box. I went down into the basement workshop, where the air still smelled faintly of sawdust and motor oil. I sat at my father's old workbench, placed his digital watch next to his old toolkit, and looked at the spot where he had recorded his final message to me. "We're clear, Dad," I whispered to the empty room. "The house is clean." For the first time in 3 years, I took a deep, full breath of air, and for the first time, it didn't feel heavy at all.